I had a when I started, I had a full head of hair. I think that's the best opening line to any recording. So it was a long time ago, and it was. I came from a background originally from the arts world. Then I moved into branding in the mid 1990s. I went started working in branding agencies, advertising to branding to marketing. Joined the BBC as brand manager North, um, which I like to always say in a Leeds accent. It sounds much better as brand manager North. It was being probably the only northerner in marketing at the BBC at the time. I used to like making a point of it. And then in the very early noughties, after a sort of chance meeting with a wonderful chap called Tony Aggie, who was, I don't think he is anymore, but he was the controller of BBC.co.uk. He then became director of digital at New York Public Library, but a credible visionary. I mean, so much of what the BBC now has pretty much came out of Tony's brain in the early days. Or he spotted things that he sort of got a gut feeling for, and we wouldn't have the iPlayer, the mobile services, all sorts of stuff in learning and children's, and there's so much of it started out as things that Tony sort of began. And I had this chance meeting with him. We had a conversation. BBC has extraordinarily long history around accessibility that goes back to the 1920s, because it was an employment scheme for engineers coming back from World War One to build a national radio network. And naturally, you had people who were vision impaired, including the first director general, gunshot wound to the face. He had one eye missing. I think he was vision impaired in the other, and they helped set up wire and fund wirelesses for the blind. And then they went on to invent Envision signing, closed caption subtitling. They built the first production tools for audio description and bimedia production and all these other things that they pioneered in the broadcast space. But I just raised it from a marketing point of view and saying, we're not giving it's a customer experience problem. And then in pure BBC fashion, they gave me the job, which is what I was not after, and they gave me a project to work on, which became BBC iPlayer. So I did that. I set up the team. We did a lot of stuff over 18 years. I got to work with some incredible people, and like Ian Hamilton is a good example. And Ian and I, along with a couple of others, drafted the first publisher created games accessibility guidelines and things like that. So there was a lot that happened in that period of time. And I ended up becoming a head of UX design because I also set up a design research team. But I left 4 or 5 years ago to become director of a startup, a couple of startups, and also do some consultancy work. But I had questions, I had things that bothered me about accessibility at scale, because I'm very much obsessed with the scalability of things, and this is why I kind of got involved in and setting up the couple of teams that I did that's within one startup, which is now sort of going live this year fully, which is something I'm going to talk about a bit.
Gareth, you're on mute.
I have somehow muted myself. Absolutely wonderful. I have no idea how I did that. Honestly,
That
two
happened about
technical fails within 5 minutes. This is absolutely superb, and they're all down to human error, and that human is me. So yeah, before I get started, I'm not sure at what point I muted myself, but before I get started, I'm going to talk about a couple of little things around language and a little bit around concept. So when I talk about things, because terms we use, accessibility and disability, they're very, very loaded, and lots of people have preconceived ideas about what they mean, and we often have very different ideas about what it means. So I'm going to define it for when I'm talking about it within this, so you know what I mean by it. And I often think about disability rather than in these contexts in a political sense or even in a social sense. I try and think about it as experience, as customer experience. and which is very much a more of a design approach to accessibility and disability. And it's often referred to as the social model of disability. You may or may not know what the social model or the medical model of disability are, but medical model is very much a factual, Gareth has ADHD, therefore we expect X. And it comes with a lot of preconceptions in people's minds, what people can and can't do. There's a huge deal of inaccuracy in the medical model, but it's very good for medical professionals because they're dealing with conditions and syndromes and impairments and stuff. But it's not very, very useful when it comes to design because we have a tendency of overgeneralizing in the medical model. Whereas you start from the social model, you look at it as a design. You look at it as a design challenge. I'm not still on mute, am I? I just noticed someone saying. I hope that was kind of earlier. But so when you're thinking about it as a design challenge, as a design idea, people have impairments. Now, those impairments may be permanent, they may be temporary, but we all can have impairments. See, I wear glasses. I've just taken my glasses off. I know you can't see me. I now have impairments. I can't read the screen, but I put my glasses on, which is one of the world's oldest assistive technologies, and I can now read the screen. But I have an impairment and I have an environment, and this slide deck is an environment. It could be a physical environment, such as the room I'm in, the workplace I go to, the bus I try to board. It could be a digital environment. It might be the environment surrounding a product and the way that you unbox something. A box is a miniature environment. Environments happen in sort of these micro and macro terms. And the way that our impairment and the environment interact, that is when disability happens. So if the environment has not been designed to take into consideration my impairment or my condition or whatever, then I am disabled by that decision. And I find this a much more useful way of framing disability because it becomes disability as an outcome of choice. There's a wonderful way of thinking about this, and you can think about this in any terms in product, is that when you're right at the start of any project, when people are just discussing, what is it we're going to do? We're going to build this thing. We've got this idea and we're going to design and create a thing that resolves a problem. At that point, the project is 100% accessible to everyone because it's just an idea. But when we start to make decisions, when we start to say, right, okay, this is our design approach, and these are the technologies they're going to use, and these are the methodologies, and these are the techniques. When we start to make those decisions, that is the point when we start to design barriers in, because we're not thinking about people's sort of needs to be able to work with them. And so disability, or sort of accessibility or inaccessibility is an outcome of a design approach. It's not a thing that exists that you then, have to deal with at the end. It doesn't pre-exist. It only exists because of what happened in a process, which is why embedding sort of inclusive design and inclusive thinking within projects is so important. So there's so many examples of where this can happen, not just in where it becomes the individual as impairment, but where an environment impairs a large group of people. And every time there's a new director general at the BBC, I always got to spend time with them to talk to them about disability as experience. Not just disability within demographics or disability within the terms of the aims of the organisation. It's always interesting with the BBC. It has a royal charter. It's exempt from just about every law going, but around disability, because everything is sat within either an act called the Communications Act, which governs broadcasters in the UK, but it also has a royal charter, which is a legal document. And in the royal charter, it says the BBC is for everyone. It's the most powerful piece of disability legislation I know, and the simplest piece because everyone is never caveated, and it's the most inclusive word. Um, so here is the newsroom. Now, if anyone has watched BBC News or seen, World Service News or anything, they'll be familiar that in the background of the broadcast, there's all of these people, and it is very big. And it even in this image, it shows a lot of desks and a lot of journalists. It's a 24-hour operation. It actually extends sort of even further in various different directions, and there's a couple of hundred people at least involved in this space, and there's lots of edit suites and all sorts of stuff. And this is where rolling news gathering happens. This is in broad television centre in the BBC, and so we went down and had a look at it. And down when you walk around there, we were looking at various different things, and there were TVs strategically placed in various points because all of these journalists need to know what is going out live. News is the zeitgeist. It's the thing that is happening of the moment. And, there's no such thing as, if news is late, news is late. So you need to stay in touch with what's being on broadcast all the time. But the problem is it's an open plan office. And I remember with one of the DGs, I think it was Lord Hall, Tony Hall. I said to him this is disability in action, because the thing that we're doing on every single one of these screens is we have live subtitling happen. So there is a team that operates 24 hours a day. They do this re-speaking where they listen to what's being said, they re-speak it into speech recognition in a closed environment, and then they correct the spelling mistakes or things that the machine struggles with by hand, and they hit about 98% word accuracy through this extraordinary thing. And this team constantly works, and it's great for our output, but it's also incredibly useful for these journalists because they have been disabled by the design of the space. They can't turn the sound up because that will interfere with the conversations that are going down. They need to stay in touch, and they can't put their headphones on to listen because they need to communicate with other people. And so the space has audibly disabled them in terms of the output of the organization. And because luckily we were doing 100% live subtitling across all of the live outputs, they are able to stay in touch. So this is environmental accessibility happening. And so this was that thing of trying to get them to understand that, disability, yes, it's something that we need to think about from a cultural and social point of view, and the access needs beyond this, but access around accessibility is a much broader thing. I always think it starts with for me anyway. I mean, there's lots of stuff that happens before Dieter Rams, but for me, Dieter Rams as I suppose the god of product design. Oh yeah, lovely. Is Dieter Rams' principles of product design, which he came up with probably in the late 1960s, early 70s. He wrote them, but which is we're still using now. Absolutely phenomenal piece of work. Dieter absolutely nailed this when he talked about people's experience of products, and he said this wonderful phrase which was right back in those days, was indifference towards people and the reality in which they live is the one and only cardinal sin in design. This is that whole thing I was talking about that whole thing at the beginning of a project and where everyone has access. But if you start ignoring people's realities, which are their needs, which are their preferences, and they may be functional needs, they may be emotional needs, this is when you start designing people out. Dieter got this when he was dealing with this in his principles, and you'll find them in his principles. And there's the 10 principles of good design, and I love these old Braun products which look extraordinarily like Apple products, but he did mentor Johnny Ives, and there's a lot of comparisons. And most of these products here are from the 1960s. I always find that fascinating that the Apple calculator on the iPhone looks almost exactly the same as Dieter's physical calculator. And there are lots of these little drilled holes and various bits and pieces on Apple products, very, very similar in concept. But Dieter, said good product design makes a product understandable, perceivable, operable, understandable. He was already talking about that principle back then. It's good design is as thorough down to the last detail. Robustness and consideration around people's needs is such an important thing. A good design makes a product useful. And he doesn't say it's useful to them, he just says useful. And useful then can have many contexts. You can start drawing out inclusive design from these ideas. And you see them starting to be reflected then into the guidelines that we do. I WCAG is WCAG has to be brought up at some point, and there are other guidelines out there. But WCAG is useful. They are just guidelines, by the way. They're not the truth to all things being accessible. They're just a very useful resource. Guidelines are just guidelines. The clue is in the name, and they have principles. And I have, coming from a brand management point of view, I kind of have an issue with them but they're very useful. I think the perceivable, operable, and understandable very much map into Dieter's ideas, and are very sensible. And I think robustness as well. There is a mapping in there, but robustness is more about that kind of universal control. But the problem is these are not customer experience principles. They're an approach to a potential way of creating products. And I've always thought that there should be satisfactory at the end. It's a missing principle. It's fine because you don't have any quality in this without satisfactory. It still maybe ticks the 4 boxes, but it still may be unusable. And without satisfactory, you don't have usability in there. So I kind of struggle with this. And I think Dieter's things and these, between the two of them, you find more of a truth within them. Because at the end of the day, we all have needs and we all have preferences. Personally, my needs, I've already said, I wear glasses, so I have, age-related vision impairment. I have ADHD. I prefer fewer things to deal with. I like clear and precise language. I have appropriate typography because of my dyslexia, although I don't like dyslexic fonts, but I'm not going to go into that. I just like decent typography that's contextual. But anyway, I need things that support my memory. My working memory is not brilliant. Again, down to my ADHD, probably. That's what we assume. I have preferences around, listening to, long form speech. I like quiet places. I usually need a little bit more time to get things done. These are all sort of design considerations that I would expect that would meet my needs and preferences. This doesn't necessarily mean that they'll create barriers, because accessibility is about barriers, but between barriers and usability, this is where, there's somewhere in this in context of everything that I deal with, there's a sweet spot. And this is why we kind of started with a project. I mean, it all started really at the BBC when we were trying to scale up our operation back in about 2008, and scale up accessibility. And we just started to look at that fact that, things like atomic design systems, which were in their early days in those, and the BBC had one of the first, it was a great way into this. But design is more than an atomic design system. Design is half of design is an atomic design system, the things that you build a thing out of. But design also has practices within it. Design systems are very, very useful. And AliQuest is a resource that we've kind of built over many years, and many people have been involved in it, and their knowledge has been captured as to how to pull together a single source of truth around design practice, inclusive design practice. But the thing is, we talk about design principles, and principles, when it comes down to it, they're kind of a straightforward thing. They're kind of a high level thing. But we have practices and patterns. And practices and patterns are so important, because one of the things when we're starting to do this within practical terms, the patterns are really important. You need to know what an accessible button is. There's a visual aspect to it. There's affordances, the signifiers. There's the way it's constructed and marked up and labeled, and lots of different things to think about. But there's also these other things in there with practices that you put it in context of a branding system. There's typography. There's the language of the page that it sits in. Practice. You may need to hide additional elements because there's not enough information. within the visual experience to create a meaningful audible experience of that button. There's lots of stuff that you add that's contextual around it, and we often forget to look at those within design systems. And our aim really around, and I think the aim of any design system is not for it to be about the designers. It's about to make, inclusive design easy for project managers, because project managers are the key to accessibility. They are the people that decide whether something gets descoped or deferred. They or they or even whether they have the bandwidth. They're I always found them the most fascinating group in every organization I've ever worked in, because they rock up usually with no in their head, because they've already got too much to do. Their team's already been asked to do too much in too short space of time. And accessibility, then people then walk up with a whole load of stuff and say, see these guidelines that you don't understand and are not in context of building or designing anything. Can you please implement them? And they're just the wall. And the thing that with project managers that we learned over this period of time, and the way we've been sort of developing resource around it, is that they need to know specific things that they can then instruct the people that are working on it. Designers need to know, okay, we're building a carousel or a slider or whatever. A designer just needs to know, what are the things that I need to understand about inclusive design for a slider? Just tell me those. I don't need to know the engineering. I don't need to know how it's tested. I don't need to know anything about this. I need to understand. I need to go and play with one. I need to understand things about the users. Designers are very, very good at designing, and they should be let to design, but they should also be given the information that will enable them to design. Not a diktat, but it should be informative. Developers are just want to know the methodologies. Most developers, when you talk to them, they just go, "What is it that you want me to do?" It's the question they asked you, and then you say, "I would like you to do guidelines," and it's like, well, that's not really an answer. It's like, no, I'm doing a thing over here. Tell me the methodologies I want to use. What does good look like? Should my code behave? Don't give me the code. Let me be a developer, but tell me how my code should behave. Project managers also need to know that these two groups of people are talking to each other in the right way. It's one of the things that we've learned over the years, is where most of the problems happen is at the point that designers hand over to developers, or when they're working together and they're not communicating properly, or don't have the framework to communicate around inclusion in that partnership. Really, really, really useful. How do you frame that conversation? What should a designer be delivering to the developer in a way that the developer needs it to be delivered? And to make sure, because as soon as you get developers making design decisions, sometimes they do a great job, but you're adding risk to the process. And testing is the other thing that project managers, the definition of done. We talk about this so often within Agile. Let's just define it. Let's look at this from an atomic perspective. Done for a button, there's only so many things that you can do that are done that are both fundamental within the pattern and within context for a button. So let's define them. Why do we expect, when a tester looks at this, they look at the guidelines, and the guidelines don't tell them the tests that they need to do. The guidelines just give them everything. And they are supposed to take all of that and somehow understand it all and put it in context, then write tests, then implement them. And they're not assistive technology users, and it all goes wrong. And this is when things get deferred and descoped. And and they just want to know, they need to know, not just the approach, but maybe even the scripts. And this is the thing that I've been working. There's 5 of us plus a satellite of others, plus a larger satellite of other people that have put even more information into it, that we often lose within projects. We discover these things and then we forget to document them. We forget to capture them. We're not very good often within organizations as being retrospective. Once we've learned how to do an accessible button, we should never have to learn that process again. We should capture it and then reapply it in every single one of our processes. But I'm sure that there are other people on this call who've been accessibility managers and you're sitting there going, I've actually, lost count of how many times we've talked about heading structure. You should only ever have that conversation once. and you should discover it, and then the organization should learn. And I think this is one of those learning challenges that we have, and this is what AliQuest, which is this project, which is part of Ably, is doing. And inclusive design within that context, when you're starting to talk to designers, it's not a checklist. The further I get into design, the further away from guidelines I often get into it, because guidelines are, again, they're very useful. They're guidelines, but they're not design. They're a bunch of things that we've learned that we can learn from, and then we need to apply. We don't, it shouldn't be a checklist. If checklists worked, if checklists actually did work and gave you inclusive design, I always say, I've said this so many times, and I apologize if anyone's heard it before, but why don't we just fire all the designers and replace them with checklists? Why do we need designers if checklists work? The thing is, we need designers because checklists don't work. Checklists are important things, that they might be a checklist of, have we made sure we've done an activity? But a checklist should not be an answer. It should not be a fundamental truth, because there are caveats to every truth. It took me a few years before I found out why I found a context where more than one heading level one, because people say within accessibility, the heading level one is the most important thing on the page. It's a usability thing. I know it's no longer a WCAG requirement because of this, but it was very much in the early days. H1, I think originally WCAG said it should be the first heading on the page. BBC said it should be the most important heading on the page. And eventually, I think WCAG leaned to the BBC approach, because we were doing news stories and we had global navigation, and it would mean that the first heading would have been in the global nav, and it would have been the same on every page, and that's pointless. It should be the heading of the news article. And so, but then I started working with legal teams, and I discovered that then you can then have legal documents where you have two sections of them with equal legal requirement, and you can't then impose a hierarchy of usability on that. So all sorts of, there are always caveats to these learned truths, and inclusive design needs to be something where we tell designers the things that we've learned, and the things that they need to consider, and the approaches they need to take. And because why relearn if we've already done something a million times and we know, this will give you a good place, but also give them that place and that freedom to question and to discover. And and it's not just, I'm going to quote Ian Pouncey now, who's again, he's one of my colleagues in Ably, but he's also, and AliQuest, and he's also, we worked together at BBC many years ago, and he's well known. Ian said many years ago, he said, HTML is screen reader UX, and and it should be designed before it's coded. And so what lies beneath design isn't about just what you see; it's about the way you create. Architects don't just draw the outside of the building and go. They have to think about what's inside the building and how it functions and how it works. And designers have to do exactly the same. It's not just about the inputs and the outputs of the building. It's the way the building functions. And it's the same with every single component. And if we're going to do inclusive design, we need to be designing the code that sits underneath it. We need to say how it should behave and how it should be structured. Everything that is a user experience outcome of coding should be a design decision. And that's something I fully believe. But the thing is, we have to evaluate that. And this is the other part of it. We can do a lot of this stuff that's approach, and we can contextualize guidelines and bring in best practice and turn them into design systems and look at components and look at practices. But the only way any of that should sensibly evolve is by looking at the outcomes of those decisions and learning from users. It shouldn't be and okay, we can test against guidelines and that's useful, but it should never be then that is where accessibility ends. We need user data. And it should always be about people. If it's not, then we've de-scoped design. If we're just using WCAG, and then design is taken out as a consideration. It's more I like to call that legal experience design rather than user experience design, because we're designing for a legal requirement rather than designing for customer experience. And it's interesting, the EAA has kind of gone back to customer experience, which is kind of interesting, and it's kind of wrestling with it a lot more in its in this new regulatory framework that we're looking at. And it refers to guidelines as voluntary, which it just expects you to do, but it doesn't treat those as an outcome. But I think this is where the other side of this, once we've dealt with our approach, the other side is we need to understand what did that do. And I've done, I was brand manager. I was obsessed with data as a brand manager, and then setting up a design research team. I got obsessed with data again. And there are two methodologies, and there are two uses for those. There's one use for each of those. Qual is fantastic for informing. Qualitative design, where you're sitting down with people, you're understanding stuff, you're doing studies into people and their lives and their needs and their preferences and social groups and all sorts of stuff. This stuff, even formative, lab-based research, is really, really good for getting information to designers and helping them understand more about, diversity and complexity within user needs, and getting under the skin of other people so they can make better design decisions. But none of those methodologies are good for informing the outcome, because they're just too small. Quant is the only way you can reliably evaluate an outcome, because you have a huge amount of people that will use it. Even if it's 100 people, that's a lot more than one. I remember sitting in a meeting once, and this was in BBC News, and I won't claim to be the person who asked the question. I was actually thought of it and I was too slow. And it was Michael Matthews, who's another colleague of mine, came up with this. We were sitting through a presentation, and someone said, person delivering it said, 75% of blind people want X. It was a very, confident statement. And my brain went, there's something wrong with it. Michael's hand was already up. And he said, how many people did you ask? And they said, 4. So he said, no, 75% of the 4 blind people that you asked wanted X. You cannot extrapolate, a community from such a tiny sample, because the next 4, it might be 25%, because 3 of them don't. You just don't know. There's no way of using qual. Is really hard. There's a lovely phrase which is, data is not the plural of anecdote. A lovely saying, which I completely agree with. But we need quant data, and we need it from our customers. And because disabled customers are there, we already have them. We know they may be having a terrible time. If they're not there, then they're not getting in through the door. That's a data point. That's an interesting perspective. If you can't find them, then you'd have to look at the front door. We stopped people even getting in the building. But if they are there, we need to understand, and we need to be able to identify them. We need to be able to understand their experience. Oh, there's that data is not the plural anecdote. Forgot it, put it in there. And we need to think about that as far as aspects of design are concerned. And I've boiled it down to a small list, which I've been using for years. And I think, layout is usable. This is navigation and sort of mental mapping, being able to actually understand where things are and where I want to go and what my choices are. The layout is functionally usable to someone, whether they're sighted or not sighted, whether they have a cognitive condition or not, whether they're using Zoom. It should be that people should be able to orientate. Really, really important. Number one thing, because if they can't find their way around, then everything else goes out the window. Content has to be consumable, and consumable is an interesting word, because there's a lot of different contexts to consumable. Whether the content is a video that you're watching, but it should be consumable if it's factual, giving information. But if it's a drama, it should be enjoyable within consumable. So there's a context to consume. I remember once we did some research on closed caption UX, the BBC, and it was an interesting one, because it was when we started to segment deaf and hearing impaired audiences into different user experience requirements. And we realized, the reason why closed caption subtitles are where they are, the size that they are, and the colors that they use, all goes down to the technical limitations of teletext, which was a system that was designed in the 1960s. And we've just that system's disappeared, but we kind of got this hangover of a design limitation becoming core user experience, and the design limitation doesn't exist anymore. But we realized within the group there were three core users, and we were showing them lots of different types, we would lots of different genres, and we realized there were some people that had very poor hearing, but they could hear some words. And what they were doing is, because we were eye tracking them and interviewing them and going through all sorts of stuff with them, we understood that when they couldn't hear what was going on, they were dipping into the closed caption subtitles. So they were supplementary. So they needed to be on long enough for them. I don't hear the word, it's still visible. And so they became a supplementary thing. We then had another group of users who were lip readers predominantly, and they may not be able to hear, they may be able to hear, but lips were very, very important for them. And where they couldn't see a mouth, or someone had a beard, or they had their hand over the mouth, or whatever, they would drop in and read the text. They were dropping in. And then we had the third set of users who couldn't do the first two, and they were closed caption first users, and they had the worst experience because they read the caption, they looked up, and people were looking in different directions, facial expressions had changed, action had moved on, body language was different. And when we started for them moving the words up to the people and changing the layout and made it more almost like comic book to them. I remember one lady, she just in tears, she said, I think we were watching Pride and Prejudice. She said, it's like my previous experience was like listening to a robot read it. And now I get all the emotion because I can now see it. And you suddenly realize that content consumable is emotional data, not just functional. Behaviors should be expected. Oh, this is, we always talk about within usability, we talk about web conventions and affordances and signifiers. A button should look like a button, should behave like a button. I remember being asked to look at the first version of the UK's BritBox, which the BBC did not build. It was built by one of the other partners. I won't name them, and I couldn't get hold of it until literally 24 hours before it went live. And they sent me, and there was a whole load of things on the front page that were styled as buttons, and they were not interactive elements. And I just sent back it was back to the DG's office, and I sent back a note that's saying, I'm sat here with my iPad tapping away on the buttons like a budgie head banging a mirror, and nothing's happening. I don't understand why this doesn't work. Things should behave. I think they came back to me actually after that and said, could you resend that again, but with less sarcasm? Although they did enjoy it, but it was there was a discussion that came out of this. Things had to be resolved, but things should behave like we expect them to see. We see a door handle, and we see the word push on a door. We shouldn't expect to pull it. Things should make goals should be achievable, and enjoyment is a goal, or participation is a goal, or doing your tax return is a goal. You should be able to get to the outcome. Applying for a job is a goal, but the thing is, it should happen also in a time that is reasonable. In a time that people expect it. It shouldn't necessarily be the same for everyone because we all have different expectations about how long things should take. But it shouldn't be to a point where it's so ridiculously different. We did task analysis for a lot of the internal systems at the BBC, and that was another team that I took over for a couple of years before I left. And we were evaluating internal systems, and I had a bunch of fantastic accessibility engineers I work with and test engineers. And one of them, my friend Jack, he's absolutely great, brilliant engineer, and we got this taxi booking system in it, and the pair of us tried it out. Now it was like, it took me 5 minutes to book a taxi, took him 15 minutes. He was able to book a taxi. But because he was a screen reader user, it took him longer. And I said, this is not acceptable. And we escalated this up to senior management and said, look, what is the expectation here? This thing is standards compliant, but it impacts Jack 3 times more than it impacts me. And that's not an acceptable metric, because where is he supposed to find those extra 10 minutes? Is our expectation, if Jack is, a journalist, or Jack is whatever he's doing, Are we expecting him to find that 10 minutes by taking fewer or shorter breaks? Is he supposed to work that extra 10 minutes longer, or is he supposed to be a little bit less productive, or even under more pressure because we've taken that 10 minutes away from him? And then what is that compound effect on every other system that's going to compact on him? And the two of us are doing the same job. He's equally, if not more skilled at it than I am. So why is the expectation lower for his customer experience? And they went, well, none of those are acceptable. So we had to bring in task analysis to evaluate internal systems on members of staff, which is a far more meaningful metric. And lastly, things should work with our setups. As a usability thing, I have my preferences on my phone, on my laptop, on my whatever. And I have my browser preferences. Things should just adapt. I think Mike Paciello wrote about this in the first ever book on accessibility that was in the year 2000. I can't remember it's called something like just web accessibility or something, but it's got a longer title than that. But you can find it. And he talks in the last chapter about the way that accessibility has to evolve as the systems change to our needs. We shouldn't have to adapt to the system's needs. And we're starting to see this more and more now. But it should, just the way we design things, it should sit down. It should not block me from doing something. It's like blocking Zoom. Zoom will happen. You can code it out. And it's a purposeful thing to do. But why? Don't do it. Just let things work with people's preferences. And these, need to evolve with good data questions. So if we were looking at layout usable, is could the users perceive the layout design? Were they able to operate navigational elements? Did they understand links, headings, etc. when read in isolation? Each one of these concepts as well, we can unpack these within the designs that we're doing, both within the design systems that we're creating and the customer experiences creating, but also in the data models then that we're implementing on top of it. Because if we end up with better insights coming back from the data, we will then make better assumptions within our systems and we'll end up with better outcomes. And better outcomes is what this is all about. But it's a weird loop when it comes down to it. And it all starts with insights. There's a lot of collective knowledge. You can find insights out there, and some are good and some are not so good. And you have to be mindful about what you draw in if it's from third parties. But when you've discovered something, sort of capturing that, which was why the BBC had its own standards and guidelines. Everything that was in there was captured within a product process. We built it up from data rather than from like expert review, which is more like WCAG is a group of people in a room, they discuss things and then come up with something that they can all agree with, and then that gets published. Whereas with the BBC's guidelines, as we would try things out on multiple products, we would learn stuff, and then to make sure that we didn't lose it, we would capture it in a guideline or as guidance, so then that can be reapplied into products. Two slightly different ways of doing things, and both with their pros and cons. But this is the cycle of accessibility and inclusion that needs to happen. And without data, you can't evolve your knowledge. Someone, and I can't remember who talks about cupcakes. I'm trying to remember. Someone brought this up the other day. At the end of the day, it kind of is all cupcakes. These. If you can't see this image, these are lovely muffins. They're chocolate muffins, and they've got chocolate chips in them. And I haven't had lunch. And I am now wishing I hadn't put this image up because I am now super hungry. But the thing is, if you're going to evaluate these things, it's like someone said, let's evaluate them. You have a look at them, or you might pick them up, you smell them. They might feel nice. They might, this looks tempting. This smells nice. This smells good. Feels good. It's not soggy, whatever. We then taste them. We experience them. We talk to others about it. It could be in an environment. We might be sitting in a nice place, having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee with these. There is experience that happens around these. And when we evaluate it, we think about all of that, this user, this customer experience of these delicious cupcakes. And, it might be we bought them somewhere and they put them in a box and we take them home and we've got to get them home safely. It's more than just the cupcake, the experience. And yet, when we are asked to evaluate these with standards and guidelines, it's like someone just giving you a chocolate muffin recipe and saying, tell me how good these cupcakes are from this recipe. This amount of flour, this amount of eggs, this amount of milk. Here's an approach to doing it. Here's how hot you cook them out for long. How good were they? Were they tasty? And it's like, I don't know. It's just give me 10 different bakers and you'll end up with 10 different versions of this cupcake. They will all do it in a slightly different way because that is design. This is again, I'm supposed to be making the point over again. You can't use WCAG to evaluate design, just like you cannot use a recipe to evaluate a cupcake. The other thing that I'm gonna waffle on about, I'm realize I'm plowing through an enormous amount of time here, and I'm not quite sure how well we're doing on all of it, but it's I've got a few slides left, not many. But the thing is, it all comes down as well to comparative customer experience that is regardless of user need. I've talked about the needs, people's preferences, and the fact that all of our needs and preferences change all the time. My needs and preferences change during the day. I've got less energy in the morning, less energy at night than I have in the middle of the day. And so I'm more cognitively impaired at different times of the day. Or I might have a very good lunch and then suddenly all my blood rushes to my stomach and suddenly I've got less to deal with. We are not a constant within this. But it should always be comparative or comparable customer experience. People should come out of it being satisfied, going, it met my expectations. I was able to do the thing. I kind of enjoyed it, or I didn't feel stressed by it. I was able to participate. And to do that, we need everyone's data because you can't just go and just ask a disabled audience what they want. You have to ask the whole audience and then segment by need. It's the only way you can really do this in a meaningful way. And you find this in, EAA segmentation is fascinating within it. If the European Accessibility Act, it's all there in Annex 1, which is, really, really useful. They talk about vision impaired users with no vision, with poor vision, people who are contrast sensitive, people who are, it could be keyboard navigators, but people with motor impairment, color blindness. They talk about hearing impairment. They talk about this, and it's one of those as well. This sounds like, it's a mixture. It's not very. It's mostly social model. It's people who can't process color. But the thing is, they're not trying to diagnose people within this because in various contexts, all these impact us in various different ways. There's an interesting one, and I can't mention the name of the company. They're a very big haulage firm. Contacted me over lockdown in America, and they wanted to talk to someone outside of America because they didn't want a biased piece of advice back about American law, which I thought was very, very strange. But they asked me to sign an NDA, so I couldn't tell anyone who I was talking to. But they just said, look, we don't see why we should have to do accessibility for the apps that we build for our drivers. We have drivers going all over the States. He said, because none of them are disabled, or, none of them are screen reader users. And I said, hang on a minute. I said, every single one of your drivers is vision impaired while they're driving. Because if they're looking at an interface, if you're designing things on that iPad to work on an interface, then they're not looking out the window. And that's not good for business or anyone else on the road or the driver. So the only way they can deal with that in a safe way is to pull over and deal with what they need to deal with. And if there's something urgent, that's fine. I said, what you should be thinking about is speech in, speech out. So their eyes are still looking at them and their hands are still on the wheel or stick or whatever they need to be on. You're not adding risk. So in terms of your user experience, every single one of your drivers, you should treat them as vision impaired. And it ended up quite an interesting conversation that came off the back of it. Not quite sure if they actually fully landed, but they kind of got that and stopped seeing it as a compliance and started seeing it as an interactive thing. And, this is where I've gone off on a slight tangent here, but this is where, segmentation is really important. And if you've got usability information coming in, you need to be able to segment your audience by need on that usability data. But you also need to know everyone who does not fit in any of these groups. Default as a control group is the most important because then you can find out whether anyone is having a worse experience. If you want to deal with equality, you always have to answer the question equal to what, which is why you need default. Now, if this group are having a terrible time and everyone else is having a terrible time, actually you've got equality. You've got a bigger problem than just accessibility. You've got, terrible customer experience. But if no one is satisfied, you've got. But if the default group are having high levels of satisfaction and any of those groups aren't, you then have an accessibility and design problem. And you put those in context of the different things that you want to understand. You need navigation, expected behaviors, task completion, and were people who couldn't process color, were they able to navigate? Were they able to did things behave in a way they expected to? Were they able to complete their tasks? And once you've then start bringing these two concepts together, you end up with really useful data on a quant level. And you find neurodivergence sort of baked into that. That's a slightly different question. But neurodivergence happens within mental models, within various aspects of UX. It's cognitive design. That's a whole other presentation. And maybe we can dive into that another time. And so you end up with really interesting data sets. This is one that we ran a while back, and we were looking at scores coming through 0 to 5, good, poor to bad, and we were able to draw out that people with vision impairment around tech compatibility were having issues, and this is like UX smoke testing data. It tells us where to look, and it also tells us what's good. We often look at the fails and we don't look at the successes, and things are working expected. We should turn around and bank that and go, right, we don't need to evaluate that. Let's stop trying to audit everything and just focus on the things that are the problems. And we need to know within our data sets how much we can trust the numbers that we're getting. What I said before about numbers of blind people. I'm going to just skip through these because I think I've kind of covered absolutely everything that was in there. But I think the last point that I want to make before we get in there is all of these things are useful, but we have to remember at the end of the day, we're dealing with people, and people have two needs that we need to balance continuously. And that is their emotional and their functional needs. And emotions should never be overwritten by functional, and functional should never be ignored because of emotional need. The two things, it's a continuous balancing act. This is what branding is all about. All of us, work within contexts on services and products in organizations that have brands, and our brands make promises to our audiences. If we can find this sweet spot, then we hold that promise to the entire audience. Thank you very much. Going to stop now. I'm hoping that made sense. I went off on many tangents. Apologies to everyone, because the one reason I have slides is mostly to try and remind me about what I should be talking about. So
I think that's usually how the slides work for most of us. Usually when we're thinking when we're thinking about the presentation, we say, okay, we want to talk about all of these things, and then when you start presenting, you end up having to remind yourself. And slides and speaker notes are usually the best way to go about it. So, well, that was interesting, and that's a brilliant presentation. And this adds to the conversation you and I had yesterday as well. So it's quite interesting. We have a couple of comments in the chat, but I want to see if there are any questions that come through. Just before we see if there are questions coming through, I'm just going to point out the comments that have come in. Paul has said data is not both, right? And Michael Armstrong said,
anecdote. Yeah, it's so many times I hear anecdotal evidence, and they go, "Yeah, I need this." It's like one of the accessible fonts for dyslexic people that was in the early days of this idea that it's there's something kind of very special around it. And I'm dyslexic. I know other people who are dyslexic. None of us use those fonts. But literally, the level of research was done by the designer, very well-meaning, but he had a mate. I'm going to call his friend Colin, and he designed this thing. He'd listened to what his friend said about his dyslexia. He designed this font, gave it to his friend, and his friend went, "Yeah, that's nice." and therefore it was great for all dyslexic people. And it's like Colin was probably just being kind. I don't know. There's no data here, you know. And there are elements of this one. They're not so bad. It was good. There was elements of good practice in it, and it might be okay. Doesn't mean it's going to suddenly repair all dyslexia. And and then the mythology builds around it. But yeah, we have to be very careful with the anecdotes that we tell, because people will sometimes grab hold of them, particularly if they're an evaluation anecdote. If they're an informal, if they're an information anecdote, something completely different. And I've got, Rodrigo's on the call. He comes from the games world, and the games world do this brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. They have community, and they listen to them, and they use that as inspiration for creating and exploring. And absolutely, it's fantastic. Yeah, we all know a Colin. Thanks, God. Don't ask him. He'll just say, "Yeah, it's great, mate. Nice one." No use at all.
Michael Armstrong has said teletext still exists in the workflow, so still restricts TV subtitles.
Hey, Michael, another old ex-BBC and yeah, we worked together. He was the accessibility lead at BBC R&D for a long time, and you might recognise it was Michael's project when they were starting to evaluate user experience around subtitles. So totally credit Michael. There you go. Oh gosh, absolutely brilliant. Yeah, thanks for gaming chat. No problem. Oh, we've got a question. How do we balance a design system with the overall product experience? That is a very big question, Michelle. And I think there's two different things. I mean, you got to think of a design system as, the things that you can build a house out of. It's not a house. It's not a kitchen. It's not the bathroom. It's not the house itself. It's just, these are the right bricks. This is the right. This is how plumbing works, and the kind of this is the sort of gauge of pipe we're going to use, and the type of pipe. Design systems should give you those building blocks. Just by using them doesn't mean that the house is going to be good, because you can still be a terrible builder, or it could be a really badly architected house.
Yeah.
It's another thing. And, the house experience is built on more than that, but it should at least give us a really good starting point. And we know things as well within it, so it could be the kitchen units are part of that, but we know we don't put, a sink above a cooker. Things are, there's certain rules around things, and things that we know that make a good kitchen. And so we still have to take those things and apply them in sensible ways, which is where design practice comes in. So we have components, and the atomic system, and then design practice creates product and customer experience.
Do we have any more questions? No, I don't think so. Okay, so just to add, before we close for today, if anyone else has any questions, you should all be able to unmute yourself and turn on video if you'd like to just join the conversation and have a chat. Because we've got another 25, 26 minutes or so on the schedule. So if anyone
please do. I'm spotting lots of old friends in the group here. It's really nice.
Yeah, and we've had a good turnout today as well. I think I saw as many as 40 people on the meeting at one point. So we've had quite a few. I think Michael's just turned. There's Michael. He just turned on his camera. Michael, do you want to say hi? You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi. Yeah, I've unmuted. Hiya.
Hello.
I've got a paper in IBC.
You've got a paper in that, right? Okay, send me a link.
So, I will do. The interesting thing is you mentioned eye gaze. That's the one thing that I'm really. It's kind of like, no, I regret ever using that.
Yes. Well, it's one of those things where it's an interesting data point when put in context of other data points, but used as a tool in its own right. it can be very misleading.
Well, one of the things we've been working on with University of Bristol was correlating immersion with physiological signs.
Mm-hmm.
And it took over 10 years to work out which ones you could actually use, whilst other people had all been using them.
Yeah.
And nobody's actually done a full proper correlation between eye gaze and quality of subtitles.
No.
They've all just gone, oh, look, sciencey thing.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, we've not got enough data.
Well, no, I mean, I was talking to Jonathan from Channel 4, and he was relating an anecdote of some subtitle academics saying, oh, well, these Ofcom guidelines have changed, so all of these subtitles are suddenly going to become verbatim. And the industry people are sat there at the back going, they've been verbatim for the last 10 or 12 years. And you don't know because you don't have the data. We know because we make the damn things. And it's that kind of thing of getting enough data points. So what I'm doing at the moment is what we did many years ago, but with bells on, is to grab the subtitles, the teletext subtitles, by the way, still broadcast on VSAT.
That must be one of the oldest technologies still in use.
It's not online whatever any longer, but it's still there packetized in the digital stream. Take those, and then the soundtrack, pass the soundtrack through speech to text because it's got better.
Yes.
And I can now measure subtitle delay on a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week basis if I had a big enough hard disk.
Yeah.
And the results are frightening.
Yeah. The other thing is, the interesting thing is the EAA is now, it's actually covering video online, which also covers all the VOD service providers. So now this has raised an issue that actually, if you are producing something in the UK and then it goes onto a streaming service in Europe, it comes under the EAA, but no one has a way of measuring it.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh.
Now we'll take that offline, Michael.
Yes.
Let's have a natter.
Drop me an email. We could talk forever.
Thank you, folks at Purple Beard. You've just created a project.
Oh, I've got several of those. Yes,
Great.
All funded by a pension scheme we won't mention.
Yeah. Who else have we got online? We saw Michelle earlier. Carl, Rodrigo. Oh, crikey.
Rodrigo's just popped off. He said he's got to go. He's got to run. So
I need to reach out to him. But honestly, thank you so much for inviting me along. I mean, if there's any other questions, if anyone thinks of anything afterwards, please email me, reach out, and happy to answer.
At the Cannes event.
Unfortunately, I'm not going to be at the one in London. I can't. I'm probably going to be in Ireland. So,
okay.
Oh, someone's raised their hand.
Adrian's raised it.
Hello, what's your email address?
GarethFW@gmail.com.
Okay, all right, thank you.
If not, find me on the socials or LinkedIn or whatever, and I'm always lurking.
I see. Another question: how? I don't know. Maybe it might be like a silly question because I'm new to this subject and I don't know things I'm still learning.
No questions are silly. Honestly, none of them are. When anyone says that, they usually ask me some of the most fundamentally difficult questions. So go for it.
Well, I have a mild ADHD, and I'm tending to do things like to be perfectionist.
Mm-hmm.
So how can I reach to be like a perfectionist in accessibility design?
No one's worked out what perfection is. I think the thing is, you have to realize with a lot of these things is that it's more of a quest than a truth. And so, give me anything, give me any product in the world, I will find you someone who can't use it, or can't access it. That people are so complicated and things have so many different contexts and approaches to design. What we need to do is just do It's almost like thinking about it as optimization exercises based on what we know about humans, and constantly ask good questions. Accessibility people should be phenomenally good asking good questions. Those kids, small kids that just say, ask why about everything. Eat your tea. Why? Because I told you to. Why? And, in some ways, you need to be that kid. You need to not accept anything that you're told. And you need to search for the data and the rationale behind it to understand it, because that's the way you will do a better job. I constantly want to know. I want to know why everything. Someone tells me something is true. Go, well, that's really interesting. Show me the data. Show me the thing behind this. I need to understand this, because then I need to be able to understand how that will help me develop my practice. And I'm still learning. It's using things like guidelines are very, very useful, but they're not an end game. They're an enabler. As I always say, WCAG are just guidelines. It says it in the name. They're just guidelines. It doesn't say the web content accessibility truth. They're guidelines. Then they're not the end. And there's some really good things in there, but you will find contexts where they're not relevant. I did a load of work for Miro. I've done work for Trading Platform, and I'm currently working for a large organization as well as one of my clients that does CAD systems. And the further away you get from an American government website, the less relevant the guidelines become. Because the design and the approach and the idea of these things, the conceptual things, they're completely different. So we have to we take what looks like it's relevant and evaluate its efficacy. And then we need to ask good questions. And you start finding things out in that journey and discovering things. So be good at asking questions, be good at not accepting anything, be good at being curious. That's when you know you're good. And you know what, mate, if you're like me, I've got ADHD, then going down rabbit holes is a dream. This is why this is a dream job for me, because it's like I'm constantly finding interesting questions.
Sometimes it's like Alice in Wonderland.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it's my old
and expect pushback from people. Thank you very much. Yeah. You just have to weather it, and it's kind of there's a lot of that. There's a lot that goes on, but we manage expectations, including our own, within this process, and it's fine. And there's an amazing community out there that you can go and talk to. But anything more, please dive in. But if not, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Gareth, thank you so much from all of us, from our whole team. We really appreciate it.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes,
go for it. We're here.
If someone, as I said earlier, I'm on this journey like to start. So if someone new would start, how he should start, like how to become
an accessibility specialist. It's like becoming a film director. I remember, or anything else. I think it was Ridley Scott. Someone asked him, "How do you become a film director?" He said, "Pick up a camera, start shooting something. You're now a director. From that point on, you're just doing it." And I think it's that whole thing is, what's the next project you're working on? It doesn't matter what it is, but sit down and just go, right, how do we get the most out of this? What can I ask questions about it? You just start, and it becomes a very organic exploration. And you'll go, right, this is an interesting thing. So we're doing, I might be working on a bottle design, and there's information on the bottle, but there's also product information around this. And so from an accessibility point of view, what do we know about bottles, and what do we know about the people who use bottles? What if I can't see the bottle? What if I'm going into a cupboard and there's 30 bottles? I did some work with Diageo on this, and they asked me about bottle design, and I was like, well, one of the first things is that you've gone and for all of your, or most of your core brands, you've patented your bottle shapes, which is an amazingly useful thing for someone who's blind, because I go in there and a Tanqueray bottle is shaped like no other bottle. So I can immediately work out which one is a Tanqueray bottle. You've created an accessibility thing without even realizing it, just simply from brand. Now we need to understand the Tanqueray bottle. There might be 3 of them, or 3 different flavors. How do we find that information off there? There are other. We might get into the thing that someone might smell it, which is good. But if they don't have a sense of smell, well, what's the other way we can get information from this bottle? Could we have braille or anything that touches on it that gives us as a marker in the way that we do British money? So every coin feels different, so we know what it is. It's and all the notes are different sizes, and they now have braille stamped on them. Is there a way that we can do that? If not, is there a technology like using Navilens? Could we add something to it that brings something up on our app that tells me consumer information? You just start diving in and asking questions and go, right, okay, what is in our gift to make better within this? There might be stuff that we identify and it would make the bottle too expensive, or it would be too difficult to produce, or we can't do it in this time scale. But you find the things that are then within your gift, and it's an optimization thing. And it's like brilliant. We've evolved that experience to be something slightly better for a group of people. And the next time that comes round, that will evolve again. That's the trick to the whole. That's how you become it. Is whatever you're working on this afternoon, start asking questions.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you're an accessibility specialist straight away.
Okay. Do we have any more questions from the audience today?
Keeps seeing Carl crop up, and he hasn't asked me anything yet, so I'm kind of worried.
He just seems to pop up and say, I second that. I concur. That's basically what he's been saying for the past half hour.
Thank you, Carl.
I want Carl to come and do a lunch and learn, but he's not saying yes or no.
He just said he's too shy
to talk out loud. There we go. I'm not shy. I've got the self-awareness to be.
Gareth, that's the ADHD mate.
I'm terribly shy. Afterwards, I just run away and go, what did I say?
I know. We always say the wrong things at the wrong time sometimes. There's no filter between brain and mouth.
No, this is it. That's why I've got Tigger on the wall there. That was given to me by my team at the BBC. That was yeah.
Fair enough, fair play. Yeah, I've been told many a times that I have no filter between my brain and mouth, that I need to stop in sometimes. And I'm like, but it just comes out.
It just comes out. There we go.
I just say it as I see it.
Lovely. All right.
Lovely. Thank you very much for everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
All right.
Just
see everyone.
Bye.
One comment before I go. Gareth, we have Andy who's just put in a comment saying that they have used your stories for pushback around for devs around saying that a bus company wouldn't employ a blind driver. So that's a good shout out to you as well. And
thank you very much. Yeah,
we're glad you were able to come here and join us today, and excited to see what's cooking. Actually, we'd probably have a few more conversations down the road, but we're excited.
Lovely.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you everyone for joining us.
All right.
You all have a good
Take
afternoon.
Care, everyone.